After another week of NHL action, we have seen more teams at the bottom of the standings starting to creep their ways up, while teams that we thought were going to be dominant are slowing down a bit. So let's see where they all shake out in this week's episode of Power Rankings. And we'll start at the very bottom with a new tier that I have dubbed the relegation teams. There's just two of them right now. It's the San Jose Sharks and the Chicago Blackhawks. The Sharks in particular had a pretty rough week, going 0-3. Yes, they did have to play Vegas and Minnesota, two very good teams, but they also played Utah, who is a pretty winnable game. They lost that game and didn't pick up a single point last week. Not the end of the world to go 0-3 against this quality of competition, but this really feels like a team that's playing for next year, as are the Chicago Blackhawks in their tier. But a tier above them, we have the Nashville Predators, who are still mired in disappointment. Last week wasn't too bad for them. They had two games against tough competition in Winnipeg and Washington. They lost both of those games pretty decisively, but at this point, what are we expecting from Nashville? They're just a gut job waiting to happen at this point. But those three teams I mentioned are below the new cannon fodder tier, which is basically the bad tier, which consists of the Ducks, Sabres, Kraken, and Philadelphia Flyers. None of these teams did much of anything last week, so honestly, let's just skip it, the way their fans are probably hoping that they'll skip to the end of the season. One tier above them, a team that actually had a good week, but is just down in the dumps, separated from the rest of the league.
Future's now, old man.
The New York Islanders. This team just has to rebuild at this point. Like, yes, last week was technically a good week for them. They beat Vegas on the road and they beat Utah on the road, but this is a team that is just treading water around mediocrity. In my opinion, the Islanders need to accept that they need to do a full rebuild, just tank it out either this year or next year and get out of this delusion that they have that they can be competitive. One tier above them are the hanging around teams. These are teams that are not technically out of the playoffs right now, but they're ones who are kind of clinging to the fringes of contention, and I would be surprised if any of them made it in. This includes Pittsburgh, Montreal, St. Louis, Detroit, Vancouver, and the Utah Hockey Club. Now, people will be surprised to see Montreal and Detroit there, particularly Detroit, who have been on a heater of late. Detroit went 3-0 last week, but against pretty shitty competition. But my problem for the Red Wings and for the Canadiens is that their underlying statistics are terrible. Both of their expected goal ratios are in the trash, which indicates to me that this winning streak is probably going to balance out over the course of the next month or so. My estimation is both of these teams are going to fall out of contention within a month or two. One team who might not be falling out of contention, though, is the Columbus Blue Jackets, who have been flying up the standings and had themselves a really good week last week. Again, not the toughest of competition, beating Pittsburgh, Seattle, and St. Louis. However, Columbus's expected goal ratio at 5v5 is at least somewhat respectable compared to Detroit and Montreal's. I don't know if they're going to be able to hang around in contention, but I do know that I would say they have a better chance of doing so than most of the other teams below them. One tier up, we have three teams that are just plain mid: the Bruins, Rangers, and Senators. Both the Rangers and Bruins are seesawing between falling off and recovering, while the Senators are just kind of plowing along. And my hope, particularly for Boston and Ottawa, is that their underlying analytics are pretty solid, so hopefully they can stick around. The Rangers, I really don't know about, especially if Shesterkin needs some time to ramp up after coming back from that injury. In the tier above them, though, I finally have to give the credit to the Calgary Flames and name them this year's Chaos Goblins. As you might remember, last year, the Caps were my Chaos Goblins. They're the team whose underlying analytics are not great, and they shouldn't be winning this many games, but they just managed to keep pulling out wins for the Flames. It's largely as a result of their star young goaltender. All they do is win. Last week, they beat Anaheim, LA, and Chicago. Yes, Anaheim and Chicago, not difficult teams, but they did manage to get a win over LA. They're 7 games over 500. We just got to recognize the Flames at this point. But because they are the Chaos Goblins, I cannot in good conscience put them among the contenders, which is the biggest tier of the list so far. It includes the Devils, Wild, Kings, Hurricanes, Panthers, Caps, Lightning, Colorado Avalanche, Winnipeg Jets, and Toronto Maple Leafs. For the Avalanche, not a great week for them. A loss to Winnipeg is understandable, and a win over Minnesota would normally net them some brownie points, but then they fumbled that all away by losing to the Blackhawks of all teams. You can't lose to one of the worst teams in the NHL and not have your standing on this tier list chip a little bit. Above them, though, I have two teams who I consider to be elite, those being the Vegas Golden Knights and the Dallas Stars. Now, the Vegas Golden Knights I thought were the best team in the NHL last last week, but this week facing a lineup where they should have gone 3-1 or 4-0, honestly, they went 2-2, losing to both New York teams, winning tight against San Jose, and yes, a nice win over the Minnesota Wild. But I'm not sure if I can really buy into the Vegas Golden Knights. They are not the elite of elite teams. That's the only team remaining. The Edmonton Oilers, they have fully come back from that slow start to the year. They just continue to roll over teams. 3-1 last week. Not the best because they lost to Pittsburgh, but they're top 5 in the league when it comes to point percentage. The sleeping giant that is the Edmonton Oilers has finally awoken.